signal that I allowed you to start. Perfect. This is great stuff. It's been really helpful. I'm going to grab my book actually. My hope is that as we talk about even budgets and finances, that part of it will tie right back to what we've already heard. So hopefully we'll be able to tie that back, particularly to some of the things Andy mentioned about strategic planning, strategic thinking, goal setting. Because one of the things we have to do is to say, how do our finances and the way we spend the resources God's entrusted to us align with where we're trying to go, who we are today, who we hope to be in 5 years and beyond. So, just so you all know, I'm extremely relational, which makes me standing up and talking to a group. Monologue is not my best style, so I'm hoping for interaction as we go. I'll ask questions. Would love for you all to chime in. We'll see how far we get. I want to honor the time, talk a little bit about budgeting practices, how do we tie the budget back to mission, vision, values, oversight reporting as elders. Maybe we're looking at a potential deficit. That might even be a first-time thing right now for some of us with COVID and some of the impacts it's had on our churches over the last 18, 24 months. A little bit on the discipleship of giving, and then also long-term financial planning, which does not mean let's grab a financial advisor and get them in here, but it's more strategically thinking through how to manage finances for where we want to be in the future as well. So we'll jump in and get moving. I've provided for you all 2 sheets. If you want to look at the first sheet, they're all just at the top. You all probably all have your own budgets that you've already established as a church. Is that a safe baseline? Everybody has a budget that's been approved by the deacons and the elders of each of their churches that they operate off of? Amen. Wonderful. I ask that because in the nonprofit consulting work I get to do, one of the first things you sometimes run into is, yeah, the board's never seen a budget. And you go, we know where to start now. So the idea of having a 3-year budget, it's the idea of kind of knowing where you're going. It doesn't mean that that's all set in stone. It does mean, hey, we think this is generally where we're headed. Part of doing that, part of the fear of doing that is, hey, we may want to be able to pivot. We may want to do some different things. And if we set out a 3-year budget, we're kind of locked in where we can't do that. Know that these are always flexible. Each year you're going to approve that year's budget, so you can add things in as you need to. The other side is, hey, it's kind of good not to be able to kind of blow as the wind goes, right? Sometimes it's good to have that plan in place, which requires you've done some of that strategic planning, strategic thinking ahead of time, and then you've started to put financial numbers next to it. So I would submit to you all that a strategic plan or strategic thinking that you've done without a financial budget that shows how to pay for it is actually not helpful. Because if you don't show how you're going to pay for it, it's kind of one of those plans that winds up getting put up on the shelf, and then in a year or two somebody goes, hey, where are we with our strategic plan? And you kind of blow the dust off of it and you pull it back out. But if you can attach a financial plan, that's a strategic financial plan, to your strategic roadmap, whatever that looks like for your church, and you bounce those back and forth until they kind of equal or balance, so to speak, then you've got a much stronger position and opportunity to see that begin to actually move forward. So that's just one idea here for why you would look at a 3-year piece. If you're doing a 5-year plan, you might actually have a 5-year budget that you put together for what that's going to look like. So here's a question for you. When would you assemble a budget, and what's a good fiscal year-end date? So who here has a December fiscal year-end? All right, and then for some of you all, do you have maybe a June 30th year-end? And does anybody have a different one than those two? So when do you all start putting that budget together, if you think about from day one of your fiscal year?
6 months out.
6 months ahead of that, you all start the process?
For 1 year.
For 1 year, right, fair. Is that kind of how that is for others, or do you all have a different process for that? Couple months ahead.
Yeah, we're like 2 months.
Yep. That's kind of where we are too. We're kind of getting pieces of it approved as we go, but we're not as sharp as 6 months ahead yet. So does anybody wait and approve their budget for their fiscal year until after the other fiscal year ended to know kind of where you landed?
Well, we do that, we won't approve it until the January meeting, but it's not necessarily that we're waiting to see where we landed. It's just a procedure.
Just, that's the way it's kind of happened. I think it is good practice to begin to back that up so that you have your full budget approved before the beginning of the year. We're in a hybrid of that right now, trying to get that direction, meaning we approve our personnel budget by the December meeting so that January 1, we have the new personnel numbers and all of that. But then the rest of it gets approved in January, along with how we allocate surpluses from the previous year. I'd like to get a lot of that before the year starts, but that's just where we are in the process, to show we don't all have to figure it out yet, which is good. So that's a good question, good thoughts there. So as you think about best practices, I like the idea of 6 months is when you start that. So if you end on June 30th, then you're probably starting the budget process in January of that year. If your fiscal year is December 31, then around July, you're beginning the process of putting together those budgets, which may have different layers and levels to it, depending on the size of your church and who all has input for that. For those that have a June 30th fiscal year end, why do you have June 30th fiscal year end?
It's more based around ministry year being largely, officially ours starts sort of in August, but July sort of a ramp up month to August, and June's a ramp down from May.
So you all would say, hey, our ministry calendar kind of fits the school calendar, and so we've aligned our budget to do a similar sort of thing. I've certainly heard that from others.
We've got 2 fundraisers, full-time fundraisers on our sessions, and they're like the 2 year-end opportunities there.
Yeah, there's some real benefit to that. So if we think about the revenue side of your church, it certainly is giving and kingdom giving at its best, people practicing generosity, biblical generosity with the resources God's entrusted each of the families in your church. But it is, frankly, it is helpful to not have December 31 also be your fiscal year end when a lot of that giving is happening, where you may not know whether you're going to be budget or not at December 31 as you're about to start a new budget year. If you have June 30th, you have a lot of folks that are going to do their giving, some giving in December 31, but then you have another opportunity on June 30th to reach back out to the congregation and say, hey, here's where we are. Here's some of the things we think God's calling us to do. Would you all give generously at this fiscal year end so we continue to grow into the mission and the programs that we think we're called to do? So I like that answer as a professional fundraiser myself, but I know that's a little bit different. And you have churches that give different ways, right? I don't know if I put that in to talk about here, but there's a reality to, well, this church is an example. You talk to Philip and Sam, and this is a church with a lot of professionals in it that are getting paid monthly, they're tithing monthly, and that's wonderful. And that's certainly a practice we want to promote at each of our churches. Hey, first fruits often means, is that the first check you're writing every time you get a paycheck? So this church's budget, expenses and revenues each month are almost completely level. The church where we are, we have several folks that are business owners and they don't actually know how they're going to finish the year until they get to the end of the year. And so we can be working on trying to help them project that in some discipleship conversations of, hey, what does giving look like, how you do that? But there's a reality. I'm not telling you all you want to be in this position. We're trying to figure out how to begin adjusting it. But we have a $2 million budget and $700,000 of it comes in the last 2 months of the year. So I just wrote a note out to our congregation that's going to go out this week that says, hey, we need $750 between now and December 31. But just so you know, that's within 1% of where we were at this time last year. And so it's a huge number, but it's not unusual for our church at this point.
Third category is our church full of retirees.
Yeah.
We've educated people about the QCD of their RMD. Qualified charitable donation from their required minimum distribution.
Absolutely. So for those of you all that don't know, that's something that's really helpful, frankly, in a discipleship or shepherding conversation of giving. Once you hit a certain age, for IRAs at 70 and a half, where the government says, we want you to pay taxes on that IRA money that's grown that you didn't pay taxes on the front end, so we're going to require you to give yourself, to pull out a certain percentage every year of what's left in your IRA. Well, those folks can actually give that directly to a charity. In this case, we'll be talking about your church. And if that's donated, they don't pay taxes on any of that, which continues to allow them to take advantage of that deferred tax situation. It can actually, in many cases, allow folks that are in that age category to give more than they normally would because they're not paying taxes on it as it comes in and then turning around and trying to give that.
And also another advantage of that, what it does, as opposed to just counting on the deduction like on Schedule A, when you do a QCD, it lowers your adjusted gross income. And when you lower your adjusted gross income, it triggers less other taxes you normally don't think about. So
That's right.
that is one of the main benefits of doing the QCD is it lowers your adjusted gross income. And you're right. I mean, I'm in that category. I can give more now because I can do that. If I couldn't do that, I couldn't give it to you.
Absolutely. There's a lot of strategy around how do you maximize giving and minimize taxation and still have what you need to live on. So you're not adjusting that living category necessarily, but you're still increasing your standard of giving.
But I think this is an example here, and I think this is finance, but it relates also to shepherding. For example, I mean, like on QCD, I mean, y'all, you know about it, but a lot of people don't know about it. And we had our deacons, they wrote a little article in the church newsletter. It just kind of covered QCD and the benefits of it and this type of thing.
And it started with a disclaimer. We are not financial advisors.
This is educational. This is not legal advice.
Information only.
If you have tax questions, contact your personal tax advisor. I mean,
That's right. Absolutely. I will geek out on that stuff on the giving side, so we can talk about that offline if you all want to, but I want to make sure we're in conversation, discussion as we go as well, and still give Hutch a little bit of time in our last session. Do you all have a process for how the budget gets assembled and then gets approved? Is that something that's laid out? So is that a treasurer and a finance committee, or maybe a treasurer and staff? Do your staff put the budget together first, and then a treasurer and or group of deacons reviews that?
So we have, as a church plant, and one of the best things I've done was simply to hire auxiliary.
Mm-hmm.
And they have it's sort of like outsourcing your business administration. So they do all the nuts and bolts on QuickBooks and reporting and that sort of thing. So that's super helpful to have that. And then when it's come time to make a new budget, I have a member of our provisional session who works with me and the auxiliary guy, and we just talk because we're still in sort of the startup entrepreneurial phase.
Yes.
We don't have a lot of necessarily buy-in or other leaders yet. And so we examine the last year, we look at areas that maybe we didn't spend it all in, or new areas that we're anticipating. And I'm usually given the task of like coming back with sort of the first draft, but it has to be sort of parameters that the auxiliary and provisional elder sort of lay out, and then they come back and look at that, and eventually it gets approved by the provisional session as a whole.
So as the session looks at what you put together with Auxilio, which I'm going to just essentially say is like your treasurer and bookkeeper,
Right.
what kind of feedback do they give you, or what questions does this provisional session ask about the budget?
But they're looking at things like, where was places you allocated money, and what did you not spend and why? Where did you overspend, why? What are some things that you anticipate that you didn't do last year that you want? Comes back to your strategic plan, like what have you thought about that you want to be doing this year that needs to be looked at in the budget? Because you can't really do anything if you don't oftentimes have at least some sort of dollars to put with it. So those sorts of things. They also not only talk about expenses, they also talk about giving.
Which is great. So I want to pause that particular conversation right there for a second, and in a few slides I want to come back to it. When what we have in the room, we have guys that are church planting and guys that are in more established churches, or guys that are in renewal level of church right now. And so as you look across those, this is a great example where we're going to talk in a second about what oversight and reporting looks like from a budgetary standpoint. So as a church plant, those are fine questions to be asking as provisional session. Once you get a little further into the church, that's probably more of the monthly or quarterly reporting kinds of questions, and the annual budgeting process is a different set of questions you might be asking from an oversight and a strategic direction standpoint. So bookkeeper, another approach is to have a bookkeeper that can provide you with monthly financial reports. So hopefully everybody's getting P&Ls and a balance sheet update that's a monthly view and then a year-to-date view that shows at least last year's as a guiding line. Salary benchmarks, do you guys all use some benchmarking practices as you're beginning to set those salaries? Not to say, hey, we don't want the pastor to get paid too much, but also to say, hey, is this an appropriate range based on the community you live in, based on the job title, based on the size of the church? Does everybody have access to some of that from the PCA in Atlanta or RBI down there? Or have you thought to ask those questions?
Our session asks those questions, but they look at local community things like high school principal,
Yes.
kind of the stuff as comparative. But we need comparatives around the PCA. So if you could put me in contact with RBI, I would like to get that for my session.
Absolutely. And so just so you all know, RBI has something they put together and send out. Some folks actually like the Briarwood model and think Briarwood's numbers that they put together are helpful. And so like David Fowler at Lookout Mountain Pres has always forwarded me what he gets from Briarwood as well.
How do you get from Brian?
I asked David Fowler. That's not as helpful, but we can.
You can ask him now that you know he's in the food chain.
There you go. That's right. We can get that. And just so you all know, I don't get those benchmarkings every year. I probably could figure out how to make that happen. But often what I'll do is once I get some benchmarking, I'll add a multiplier for inflation that may be like a 2% a year. So if I'm looking at 2019 numbers or in 2021, I'm looking at all the benchmarks and I'm adding 4% to them just for cost of living. That's another sit thing.
6.2%.
So August to August inflation this year was 5.9% as a country. Somebody on your session ought to be tracking enough of those numbers to know, wow, a 2 or 3% increase in pay is almost like a 3% pay cut just to maintain standard of living. I'm not telling you all need to go and increase all your salaries 5.9% because there's a science and an art here, right? The science is benchmarking. It's things like what does a high school administrator make? It's things like what does inflation look like? But then also duties, responsibilities, time it takes each week. So there's the science of here are all the inputs, and then there's this art category of how do we put all those together, and then there's the output that says, here's a good spot to be for each of our salaries.
I know they also looked at the city manager, so that's another benchmark.
Absolutely. So city manager is a good benchmark as well for the area you're in. Coaching line item. How many people have a coaching line item in their church budget? So just a thought, we're saying this is a best practice seminar. I'm not saying that every church has it. It's easy to say, hey, you're a church planter, you should have a coach that you put in there. It's also easy to say, as we begin working with the revitalization efforts of our committee, hey, we want to see a renewal coach work with your church if you're in kind of this revitalization status. But I would submit to you that as you hear all the things that you've already heard from Andy, Bobby, and then you'll hear from Hutch as well, every good executive leader has a coach that's also helping them along. It doesn't matter what size business or entity or nonprofit they work. You all, in one sense or another, are working a business with a mission as pastors and elders. And so consider maybe part of what's most helpful for us to grow the strategies of our church, to grow the direction of our church, and frankly, to keep you all as leaders, particularly you senior pastors, focused on those areas of importance that help move things forward based on what success has been defined as within your church. Perhaps you need some kind of an executive coach or church coach to help you with that, to hold you accountable to those pieces along the way as well. And then finally, running a balanced budget. This is one Andy's heart told me about, which I really appreciate. To say, hey, you may have a budget that says we're going to get to the end of the year and have a little bit of a surplus. Well, another best practice is know where that's going to be allocated so that you're actually running a balanced budget. So it can be as simple as saying, hey, we're going to transfer this to savings, or this is a miscellaneous category for now. But know that at the bottom that your revenues and your expenses balance based on your best projections. A few items to note, even as you look at this budget, this sample budget here, have an idea of expected giving per family or per giving unit. The PCA average is about $4,500 across almost any church. It's really interesting how fast that aligns. So think through that. You can also look at your own giving from the last 2 or 3 years and divide it by your giving units to see what that looks like. So if you're in a spot where your church is decreasing in membership or increasing in membership, you can begin to see what a potential expected revenue number for the next year would be based on your average giving per family or giving unit. If you're in a wealthier area, sometimes that's gone as high as $5,000 or $5,500. I've seen it as low as maybe $4,000, but those are really interesting ranges that seem to hold up almost everywhere. But a better category would be the average of your last 3 years once you figure that out. Payroll expense. I would urge you to set a goal that your maximum payroll expense would be in the 55 to 65% range. If you're starting as a church planter, you know that's probably 80%. But as you get more and more mature as a church, that's not a fair way to say that. As things start to grow, even if you get to multi kind of staff situations, you'd really like to be in the 55 to 65% as your maximum personnel costs. A couple of reasons for that. One is, if you get so staff heavy, it may mean that we're not training and growing up volunteers to do other pieces of the work they should be doing. A second one is, if you get to a spot where there's a hiccup, like COVID, you'd hate to be 80% payroll and all of a sudden you're having to cut staff because you're struggling to make budget or keep cash in the bank. Where if you can keep it down under 65%, you got some room where you can cut other things and still care for the people that you all hired to serve the church. Missions and giving, I can't speak enough about that. We should be tithing the church income just like we're all individually tithing. I know there are questions about that. It's probably not going to be a secret as you hear me talk more and more. I think the 10% tithe is like taking the training wheels off. Like once you get to 10% tithing, you're starting to figure it out. Obviously, that's not everybody's view of giving in the New Testament. My only comment to that would be, hey, that's great. Jesus doesn't say 10%, so you want to go less than that. Give me one other instance where he took the law of the Old Testament and lessened it in the New Testament. I'm pretty sure he ramped it up above every other law that he talked about. And then identifying where to allocate surplus annually. We talked about that for a second. Any thoughts on that piece before I move forward?
Yeah, I think it was a really good point about balancing your payroll expense. And those are good numbers. I just was frantically doing the math to see where we were.
Sure.
And we're probably right at 55% with all of the staff in our church. But I see churches really go through a lot of heartburn by having too much staff and then hit a lean period, not having enough savings to get through the lean period, and start cutting people, and that's really a downer for a congregation.
That's right.
And some strategic planning, both financially and visionally, prevents that.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are the reason this, I don't know if this feels odd to anybody that this is here with all the other shepherding and strategic thinking conversations, but we as a committee really see these working in tandem. They both work together. It's almost like two tracks of a train track.
Are there similar numbers that you'd recommend in terms of fiscal plan for a church? Like you don't want to get in deeper than X percentage?
I cannot give you a specific range for that because I think it's going to be fairly dependent. I think, frankly, there There are gonna be churches where sessions say, we don't believe in debt, we don't wanna have it for our church, or other sessions are gonna say, hey, we're okay with debt. I can tell you that as a church, our mortgage wound up being approximately 18 to 20% of our budget. And now that that's actually getting paid off next month, which is a wonderful blessing, we're still maintaining about 5 to 6% of our budget. That's still going to go back into reinvesting our facilities, even though we have no debt load left. Because once you have the facilities, you got to steward the facilities. And we're actually debating that. There are folks that think it's crazy, we shouldn't invest in it. There are other folks that think we should be putting 8 to 10% aside instead of 5 to 6 to help with those capital improvements and upkeep of facilities.
What are like household standards on that?
So household standards, well, let me just back up and say this, from a government subsidized perspective, if you're trying to rent a house to somebody, they can't move into a house that's more than 30% of their income from a cost perspective.
Yeah. No. So those, sometimes you can take what, percentage-wise, what would be wise for a family, and translate it over to the church. It didn't apply every time, but it can give you kind of
No, that's right. And I would say the one caveat to that, Hutch, which I don't disagree with what you're saying, maybe that helps. But there are plenty of things as a church we weren't able to do for the last 15 years because we were paying, 20% of our expenses were going to a mortgage payment. And so we've said, hey, denominational Presbyterian giving, we can't wait to get on a mortgage so we can start investing more into those. Hey, missions, we can't wait to grow our missions giving. We gotta wait. So it's a prioritization and a give and take. And again, it frankly needs to go back to the strategic planning and strategic thinking and the budget you put together to accomplish your priorities.
Jason, I don't know if this is a good place to ask. I think it's somewhat related to questions here. If anything like this is covered later, you can wait. But I know that in personal finance, the rule of thumb, Ramsey or others would say, you need to have a 3 to 6 month emergency or something aside of your budget. Is that a good rule for churches? It should be something different or not? I mean, I know it could be good as it is, but I mean, is there another way to think about it?
So that needs to be driven by your mission, vision, values conversation and by what the session of the church believes. I would say that parameter is still a good one. If you can have 3 to 6 months of your expenses set aside in a savings account, that is a much healthier church financially. In the nonprofit space in general, less than 10% of nonprofits have that 6-month runway, which is unfortunate. A lot of churches are in the same position. But you also, it's a conversation in our finance committee right now, where maybe some folks in our finance committee are saying, let's get the 6 months cash in the bank. And other folks are saying, if we go more than 3 months, we actually believe it's a stewardship mistake because we should be deploying the resources God's giving us. And so I think that's a fair range, but there's plenty of discussion that should happen on where you fall.
One thought I had about that that makes it different is that in my family, if something happens to where my income is dramatic, that's a huge blow to my household income. Whereas in church, you lose one member, that can be significant, but it's definitely not going to be the same as, you've got a lot more giving. Now you have a significant number of people who disappear, leave, die, whatever given time, that could be the kind of thing that 3 to 6 months. But I just didn't know if there was any, I've heard people say, 3 to 6 months, but if there was a different way, but that's helpful, what you said.
Yeah. If anybody else wants to give input on that, I'm happy for that.
I think it's key, I think some people want to argue, we should be spending all of God's money. But it's not God honoring. If you don't have some kind of reserve, giving is cyclical. I don't care what size church you have, giving is cyclical. And when you have lean years, you either going to get up there and beg from the pulpit, which doesn't bring honor and glory to God, or you're going to do a lot of cutting in staff and this type of thing. So, to me, a good stewardship principle is having reserve. And you can argue about it, how much reserve and this type of thing. But I would submit that a church that doesn't have a reserve is irresponsible. Because like I said, you either gonna fire staff or cut staff, or you gonna get up and beg.
Actually, my question is probably coming from a situation where we realize our reserve is way too much. And trying to identify the place where when we finally deal with some of the issues to help us properly plan and consider how God would lead us to steward that money is where do we need to identify? Okay, right here to this point, because we need to keep that for reserve for emergency.
I would submit that you need a big, hairy, audacious goal that you could spend some of that money on, for the advancement of the kingdom.
And I think plenty of discussion can be had on it, Jeff, but it's probably wise to say, hey, we're not gonna spend more than 6 months of that, and then we're gonna see how that goes for a while.
And I think also, Jeff, it comes back to the Andy's strategic plan. Hey, Jeff, and I think it also comes back to what Andy said this morning about strategic plan. You say, well, wait, we got way too much. I think that depending on your strategic plan. Let's say you all of a sudden thinks that your next meeting session comes up and says, hey, I think we ought to take a vision, and I think we ought to consider relocating our church. We want to get out there on 27 where the visibility is great and this type of thing. Your reserves may be inadequate. So the reserves have to, I guess the point is, the reserves have to match the vision.
Yeah, so as you all work through your strategic plan, you set your big 2 or 3 or 4 priorities. By the way, you can't have more than 5 priorities because then you don't have priorities. So whatever those 3 to 5 are, you figure out what those expenses are gonna look like to get there, and then I wouldn't spend more than 6 months. I wouldn't spend down more than 6 months of your budget amount on a large reserve until you get some runway and can kind of review that and see, okay, we can actually do that on 3 or 4 months. Like, it doesn't all have to happen at the same time. It can be incremental. And so for those of you on the other side, you're going, man, we're trying to figure out how to make payroll this month. Well, get to the end of your fiscal year, and when it's time to allocate surplus, begin to figure out, hey, what if we could get 25% of the cash balance we need this year, and then next year we'll do it again. It took us at Covenant Pres 3 years to get enough cash surplus kind of in the bank to where that huge drawdown I told you all about earlier didn't put us into zero on our general fund. You know, now we're there, so now we're having conversations about, well, how much is enough or how much is too much for that savings. But we had to just get there before we could move forward. But now the church is financially healthier, which is helpful.
I think there again, it's key to me. There's some churches, quite frankly, this may sound weird, but they will run a negative deficit until the last quarter. In the last quarter is when the giving comes in, because it spikes at the end of the year. Then they will be able to hit budget. So you're exactly right. I mean, it really also comes down to a cash flow issue.
Yes.
What are your cash flows at the ins and outs?
That's right. Absolutely. So here's where I want to look at even the next sheet. If you guys want the second sheet. So there's a value allocations side here on the right half. I didn't do color printing because I was out of coloring, but those are different colors, those gray scale across the top. You could actually begin to consider how your finances align with your values by allocating every item in your budget with the values you've identified as a church. And I would even do that with personnel, because some folks like to keep personnel out of that, but the problem is your personnel is a big part of what drives those different values. So you'll see in this example, I think what I allocated was 60% of the senior pastor, in this case, went to worship, 20% went to growth and discipleship, and 20% went to administrative and just things you have to do to be an organization. That may or may not be right for you all, but you can allocate pieces of each person's salary based on what their job duties are and how it aligns back to those values you're trying to accomplish. So everything's pointing back towards true north. You know, and then you can go down through and you can see the same thing. I did the same thing on the rent or mortgage payment to the question that was asked earlier. I said, you know what? Probably half of that mortgage payment is for worship. Probably 25% of that is for growth and discipleship. 25% of that is because you got to have a place to meet. and do church. So every item somehow fits under those categories of your values or an administrative category, and it begins to let you start to ask questions. So, you were saying earlier, you were suggesting that the annual budget process is when the session's asking questions about overages. Hey, it's more than 10% over, what happened and why. I would actually hope that in the annual budgeting process, once it gets, or before it gets to sessional level, everybody in the process is saying, hey, the dollars we're wanting to spend, how does that help us accomplish our values, or just keeping the doors open? And if it does, that's great. Let's see what those percentages look like. If it doesn't, let's ask, should we be spending those funds there or not? And it goes right back to the values or the impact areas you may have established in your strategic thinking model, which I think Hutch and Andy were both talking about kind of upwards, inwards, and outwards, and you use different words for that. So those are the 4 categories we have in covenant. Whatever those 4 categories are for you all, I'm not saying these are the ones every church should have. You have to fill in the blank across the top. For us, we've said our focus is on worship, covenant life, growth, discipleship, outreach missions, and then there's an administrative category. So those are the 4 areas that we're focused on, which means that's what we're hiring towards, that's what we're allocating funds for, that's what we're doing trainings for, that's what we're building missions, ministry teams for within the congregation, and it's got to fit those 4, or we're back to having more priorities than we can actually focus on at one time. So does this investment give us greatest opportunity to reach our goals and values? That's a question you should ask every time you're trying to make additional expenses or hire new people. I would say those are also the questions you should ask to the conversations about goal setting and metrics for how you're going to measure yourself. Set those metrics based on activities that can be done, not on outcomes, because God's responsible for outcomes, you're responsible for the activities. But every one of these questions has to go right back to your true north. So as you're setting different metrics that are either missional metrics or financial metrics you want to attain as a church, ask yourself, if this is the metric we measure, is that going to give the greatest opportunity for growth in the mission of what we're trying to accomplish? Or is there a different metric that would be better? Because if you start to measure the wrong metrics, you start to realize, hey, here's true north, but we're starting to go this direction because we didn't quite measure the right metric. We kind of walked through all that. So focused on that true north at all times. Thoughts on this piece?
It's good. I encourage you. It's good.
Thank you. So oversight reporting, this is just a general template to give you to say, hey, monthly, you should be given a 1-page report to the session of the diaconate. That's not a full financial review, right? It's 1 page that says, year to date, here's our budgeted revenue, here's our actual revenue. Year to date, here's our budgeted expenses, here's our actual expenses. Year to date, here's our cash in the bank and our general fund balance. Just something that lets everybody know once a month it's being reviewed, it's being looked at, and we're in a healthy state. And we're generally spending less than we're bringing in or staying within our budgeted parameters. Then quarterly, you can give that P&L. It can be a higher level P&L, it can be categorical, but on that P&L report, part of what you're also looking at is, hey, where are we on our variances? So, hey, is there any place where we're more than 10% above or below expectations? And then the questions would be why. And often there's a reason, and you can begin to deal with those things on a quarterly basis instead of getting to the end of the year and realize you're way over or way under on the budget. It just gives you that check-in to be able to see. Your treasurer can review that P&L actually monthly from the bookkeeper. And then in an annual meeting or a semi-annual email or meeting, you can report that to the church body. And again, they're not seeing the full P&L, but as some kind of an overview to say to the church, here's where we are financially. Here's how we're making decisions on our finances. Here's how it all ties back to the mission and vision, or the 3 to 5 key areas we're working on as a church. And here are some of the opportunities to give, or the needs we have, based on how we're headed that same direction. So even in financial conversations, you're tying it all back to mission, vision, values, and where you're headed as a church together.
So at your annual meeting, you give some type of executive summary of your finances.
Correct. It's a 2 or 3 page report that's fairly graphic heavy, so it's some pie charts and maybe a bar graph or two that, so what it does is it's just enough so that the people that want the detail and to be able to say, I've analyzed where we are, get a big picture. But it's not so much that the folks that don't think about finances ever are lost. They can at least see, okay, this kind of makes sense. So it's hit the sweet spot.
And if guys object or don't feel like it's good communication to a congregation, that is profit and loss, income and expense.
Thank you.
That would be the appropriate categories.
Absolutely. And even on a budget, you can talk about a spending plan as
Or
well.
ministry plan.
Or a ministry plan. Thank you. So reading financials, asking questions, a few control points. So P&L or, what did you just call that? I'm sorry.
Income expense.
Income and expense. Look for those expense line items that are more than 10% over or under budget and ask the question, hey, why is this? You know, what's going on there? As you start to ask those questions, whoever's bringing that report to session or deacons meetings are going to start coming with answers before you ask the question. You're going to begin to put a system together that's going to work itself out. And then consider line items that aren't getting spent and ask the question, hey, why is this not here? It may be simple. Well, we haven't paid any insurance because it's an annual premium, so it's all going to get paid in September. Or it may be, hey, we haven't been able to find that person.
Most of the time, it's the annual premium got paid. Why is this out of whack?
Exactly. Well, we pay it in February every year. That's right. Absolutely. On the balance sheet, you might look at debt coverage. So this goes back, Hutch, to some of your questions. I don't have good parameters necessarily on what's a good debt coverage number, but look at your balance sheet. Where are you in assets? Where are you on liabilities and equities? And is that good? And rely on the elders or the deacons you have in the room that are financial business folks that can give good feedback and good constructive thoughts on that. Look at cash on hand. I put on here a 60 to 90 day minimum. We've talked in this room already about a 90 to 120 day minimum as a range. And then protecting your people. You all familiar with separation of duties conversation? So you probably don't ever want one person counting the offering plate, right? Or box if you're not passing the offering plate in today's world. You probably want somebody, you know, if you just have one person that's doing the bookkeeping and deposits, you might want a second person that's overlooking that somehow. Having the treasurer review, you know, maybe have one person that approves all the expense reports for everybody in your staff, but then whoever that is that's approving those, and again, I know some of you all are on 1 and 2 person staff, so this may not be an issue, but if the person that's approving all the expense reports is a staff member, then somebody that's not a staff member needs to be approving their expense reports. Just having those double checks in there to protect each other. And then big picture, so you have this spending plan or this ministry plan that gets approved annually, and the staff get to spend whatever's in that plan as appropriate, but then the larger ruling body of elders and deacons at your church needs to make any decisions that either require debt or outside of the spending plan that's been approved. It comes back to you all just for good checks and balances.
Or even large amounts within that spending plan
Very fair.
that might destroy a monthly, particularly if you're
Just
in
hang
your
on.
situation where things are postponed in December.
That's
you don't
right.
want them below $10,000. You may have a limit. Anything
Yeah.
over $1,000 has to be reviewed.
Absolutely. Good point. Any questions there? What? I want to try to honor the time. Do you want me to try to wrap this thing up in the next 3 to 5 minutes just so people have...
Yeah, so that Hutch has time to.
That's right.
Be prepared to eat.
Potential deficit, so just 2 thoughts. Let's say you guys are looking at a situation where you go, man, I don't know if we're going to make budget this year. These may seem obvious, but I didn't want to just overlook them. Hey, you need to cut all unnecessary expenses immediately. Like, let's stop the bleeding as much as possible and only pay the things out that have to be paid out. The second is to begin to share the need with the congregation that offers ways for giving opportunities and discipleship of giving. We're not going to get into this piece. I'm just going to leave you with the average evangelical gives 2.5% of income. And it's really easy to sit there and say, Hey, that's great, that's the average, our church does a lot better than that. Well, guess what? Every church thinks they do better than that. So, just keep that in mind when we're thinking through, hey, we can't ask our people to give, they're already giving so much. Or, hey, we gotta be thoughtful because, we don't want to take too much of the money people have, or whatever those questions are. Just keep in mind, as you're teaching, as you're discipling, as you're shepherding, as you have opportunities for folks to give, the average person that you're staring at in your congregation is giving away 2.5% of their income. Which means we probably don't have a problem with people in our church giving too much.
Hey, Jason, can I also just say there, you mentioned there how much the Bible talks about money. Jesus talked about money as much as anything else. So there must be an issue with our hearts and our money somewhere. And greed is such a deceptive kind of sin. It's interesting how in church, even in our shepherding, how we will deal with and address just about every kind of sin that there is, except for greed. Which I think, and I know how many churches are incredibly shy about talking about money, how many pastors are incredibly shy about talking about money, which I think indicates how sacred we think our money really is. Like it so often tends to be that one area of someone's life that I can't touch that. I can't talk about that. So what does that say? That their money is the most sacred thing in their life. We can't bring it up.
So will you share the wrestling match that you've walked through of not wanting to know what the people in your church give and then kind of coming around on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the church that I started at as a pastor that kind of assumed practice on the session is that the pastor should never know what people are giving. That should be a private thing for people. Which again goes back to that, well, what's our assumption behind that? We should think about that. Well, it's that either that I can't handle it as a pastor or that this is such a sacred thing that nobody should know about. I think it unintentionally makes money more sacred than it is. Where I think Jesus' perspective on money is like, it's just money.
Yeah.
So you can analyze money and be incredibly intense about stewardship. Stewardship's obviously important, but sometimes we can go the opposite way and be like, every single piece has got to be accounted for. When Jesus seemed to have more of a, hey, let's have an appropriate valuation on it. But, so as a pastor, I can't know what people are doing with their money or talk to them or address money, but I need to know what they're doing on, say, an issue like pornography. That seems out of whack. And that was a part of what...
Especially if they're spending their money on pornography.
Right, yeah. Well, and whenever I planted the church, my new session had a different perspective that I ended up coming around on, where they were really challenging me on that. I was kind of bringing in that value of like, I should never know what people are giving, to where we kind of had an idea of like, hey, this is one of the best indicators of where people's hearts are. When I'm looking at somebody's wallet, I'm looking at their checkbook, I'm seeing one of the clearest pictures of where they are in their discipleship in their life. So is that an area that's helpful for me to know as I'm seeking to shepherd people? So we shifted on that, where it's not like we look at that all the time, but we look at it at least once a year, where we're looking at our people, we're looking at what they're giving. And so we know, okay, these folks are really struggling. How can we come and shepherd them? Even whenever we're talking about examination, nomination of officers, one of the first things we do is we say, okay, we need to see their giving. And if someone's not giving, they are functionally disqualified as an officer. But it's a discipleship opportunity. We're going to go and pursue them and address that in their life.
So interestingly enough, you got this issue that seems to be the least talked about culturally, but the most impactful in our walk with Jesus, or one of the most impactful areas in our walk with Jesus. And so I just happen to know Hutch's session particularly well. I mean, their elders actually talk about what each of them are giving and why, and kind of submit to the brothers of their session about what that all look like. So you got an elder that doesn't have a lot to give, and he's kind of going, well, here's why my giving is what it is. But you got the other side where an elder's going, hey, if I tithe, it's going to be $30,000 in church. Well, that may actually not be healthy for the church because our budget's only $200,000, and that's 15% of the budget. So do you all think I should be tithing that full amount, or should I be tithing something that's
Yes.
fair? But the session was able to have a conversation about it so that there's not a hidden agenda. It's just, help me wrestle with what this ought to look like.
Yeah, he could give a certain part to the general fund, he could give, more to strategic objectives and
That's right.
it not make the budget, the general fund budget so dependent on one person. Which I get that, that's important.
Well, it also brings into this conversation the idea of, some people, even whenever it comes to the tithe, I mean, it's one leap to get people to tithing. It's another conversation to say, well, where should the tithe go?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Should the tithe belong to your primary responsibility, which is your local church, the body of Christ of which you are a functional member? I know a lot of people where their tithe is distributed among so many things outside the church. So what they might be giving to the church is a tiny little sliver of that. So I think it's an important question about what should the priorities be in your life about giving. I know some people that they consider their tithe what they give to their kids to help out with different things. You see what I'm saying? It's like all of these kind of mindsets are taking place in people's minds with relation to their money. So these need to be conversations we're having.
That we're bringing some biblical clarity to.
Right.
And being able to say, this is kind of what God seems to say in His Word. Here's where you have some decisions you get to make, and here's where it seems really clear.
Yeah.
Well, Hutch, since you seem to be using your time to converse, I throw one back. The ping pong this here.
Yeah.
So I had a pastor in another presbytery, another part of the country, a dear friend. He said, they just don't pay me enough to tithe. As a pastor, he wasn't tithing. And then he also had this piece of rationale, which was shocking to me. Well, I paid out of the church's funds anyway. So he was rationalizing not having a need to tithe. I said, no, brother, you should be the first to tithe. You should be the first one to put your check in the plate or leave it in the office.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know where
Like
the very
David. I mean, how did David?
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
The very first major
I'm going
donor
first.
dinner in Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah.
David said, we got a temple to build. Here's what I'm contributing. And then he went to his officers and said, what are you all going to give? And then went to the general population and said, this is what I and the leaders have given. What will you all as a people give? And there's a real transparency and a clarity to that is frankly really healthy.
Yeah.
We do that about some things, not quite that transparent, but we always make sure if we're going to have a major capital campaign on a project, we've had two since I've been there, we say, we believe this is going to cost this much. We already have this amount that's been given towards it. Isn't that awesome how God's begun to provide?
Yes.
And we need this much more from you all.
Absolutely.
And there's an implicit that first amount was raised among the shepherding.
That's right. And you don't have to say amounts or anything like that for specific people, but you can say, this is how much been raised. And by the way, included in this amount is 100% participation from the leadership of the church. So that you all are leading from the inside out, saying, hey, this is what
And
we're
also that shows whether or not God is in this project. If you need to raise, the way to not raise $1 million, let's say you need $1 million, the way not to raise $1 million is go to the congregation and say, hey, we got this project, and we need to raise $1 million. How much are you going to give? You won't get a whole lot. The best way to do it is like what he said, we've been praying about this, and we talked in the session, and we talked, and God's provided 400,000, 500,000.
That's great. There's more stuff here on the long-term financial planning piece, but I want to give Hutch an opportunity. If any of you all want these slides, I can just email them out to you, which is easy enough. But thank you all.
Thank you, Jason. you wanna just transition, brother, I mean, I don't know if anybody, if they wanna go to the bathroom, they can, but
Yeah,
this
you
is
want to
time.
take a